These are companies with decades and decades of well-documented lying to the American public.
Those who complained were fired, stripped of responsibilities, or forced out.
As we started feeding the GMO corns to our animals, we started experiencing huge reproductive problems.
Rats that were fed genetically modified tomato developed stomach lesions, bleeding stomachs. 7 out of 40 died within 2 weeks, and the tomato was approved.
What did the FDA administrators do? They had ignored, overridden their own side of statements.
Tragically, children are most at risk from the potential dangers of genetically engineered foods.
The biotech industry claims that genetically engineered foods are safe, but scientists and investigators around the world disagree. New evidence suggests that industry pressure and political collusion force these foods onto the market, and their effects on health, particularly on kids, may be serious.
To create a genetically engineered food, you take a gene from one species and you put the gene into the DNA of another species. Now, typically they do this because they want to add a trait. Like they take, for example, a gene that creates a pesticide and they put it into corn so that the corn will create a pesticide. The process of genetic engineering can disrupt the normal functioning of the DNA in dramatic ways. It can turn genes off, permanently turn them on, change their levels of expression, and create all sorts of unpredicted production of allergies, toxins, carcinogens, nutrient problems, etc.
When we got the FDA's documents and began to analyze them, we found something very shocking. That not only did the scientists who had joined our lawsuit have concern about genetically engineered foods, not only did hundreds of other scientists around the world have concern about the potential hazards of genetically engineered foods, but the FDA's own scientific staff had the same concerns. The overwhelming consensus within the FDA's own scientific staff was genetic engineering is inherently hazardous, it is very different than conventional breeding, and every food that is modified through it, every food that's been genetically engineered, has to be carefully safety tested because it runs the risk of harboring unintended harmful substances such as new poisons, new allergens.
But their superiors were under orders from the White House to promote the biotechnology industry.
They were only told, we need to have this technology moving and moving fast, and we need to have a whole new industrial sector in place.
And the person in charge of policy was a former attorney for the large biotech company Monsanto.
What did the FDA administrators do? They had ignored, overridden their own side of statements and presumed that all of these foods are safe.
No long-term safety studies, no safety studies whatsoever are required before foods are put on the market.
And that's like saying you make a car and the producer of the car doesn't test it, will let some people, get killed driving the car to see if it is safe or not. It's an absurd position, but that is the position of a lot of the people who are promoting this technology.
People were saying in the industry and the regulatory agencies that if the American people want progress, they're going to have to be the guinea pigs.
Now, there are so many loopholes and flaws in the current regulatory regime for assessing the safety of genetically engineered food that I consider this framework to be little more than a regulatory facade which enables food producers to claim that their products have been properly tested and to help persuade consumers that genetically engineered foods are safe.
They wanted to get something through that gave at least the illusion that this was being tested.
Rats that were fed genetically modified tomato developed stomach lesions, bleeding stomachs. 7 out of 40 died within 2 weeks, and the tomato was approved. Rats fed genetically modified soy had misshapen nuclei in their liver cells. Rats fed genetically modified canola had livers that were heavier. Rats that were fed genetically modified corn had problems in the development of their blood cells. Chicken fed genetically modified corn died at twice the rate of those fed non-genetically modified corn. 12 cows died mysteriously in Germany when being fed genetically modified corn. And several Midwestern farmers report that when they feed genetically modified corn to their pigs, the pigs have reproductive problems.
The mother hogs were going into their full pregnancies, and instead of a normal litter of babies, they would deliver bags of water or they wouldn't do anything. As we worked our way through this, we found through word of mouth and media coverage another 25 farmers in 5 states that had exactly the same problems.
Our whole problem was the fact that we were not getting sows pregnant. It wasn't just us, but there was a lot of people in the area that had the same problem. So we figured out that everybody was feeding the same seed corn.
We've had trouble with conception rates. We did testing, did everything, nothing worked. We're finding out it's traced clear back to the seed corn. It makes you wonder with the genetic modified stuff, what we're finding out now with it, and we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, I think.
I had one gentleman in Nebraska. He was feeding the BT corn to the sows, and he had trouble with the conception of that group of sows. He switched away from using that BT corn, and the problem went away.
If thalidomide had not caused dramatic birth defects, but rather cancer or other allergenic responses, it would still in all probability be in supply because of the difficulty of linking cause and effect.
If there were reproductive problems that were caused by genetically modified foods, or problems in liver cell development or bleeding stomachs, who would know that it was genetically modified foods? No one is monitoring. An example of how difficult it is to discover the cause of a problem came in the 1980s. There was an epidemic. About 100 people died and 5,000 to 10,000 people fell sick. They finally traced it back to a food supplement that had been created from the process of genetic modification. Only the brand that was genetically modified caused this disease. Now, the only reason that they were able to discover that it was an epidemic was that the disease had 3 simultaneous characteristics. It was rare, it was acute, and it came on quickly. If any one of these 3 characteristics had not been in place, that same deadly food supplement might still be on the market.
I think that the main problem is likely to be this long-term effect of GM. I think that the simplest analogy is smoking. How long did it take for smoking, the effects of smoking to be uncovered? 30, 40 years?
Look it over like in Vietnam where they sprayed Agent Orange. Didn't think that was going to hurt. Well, could be the same thing with genetically modified products too.
We know that soon after genetically modified soy was introduced into the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed there by 50%. Now, we can't say that it was definitely the genetic modification of the soy, but we do know that soy has an increase in trypsin inhibitor, the most commonly known soy allergen. But we also know that you can transfer allergens into genetically modified foods. In fact, the process of genetically engineering soy disrupted the DNA and caused a damaged section, which could, in theory, create an allergenic protein. Also, the gene which they inserted into the soy rearranged over time without explanation. So it's creating actually a slightly different protein, one that was never tested or predicted or intended to be produced inside the soy, and that might be allergenic or toxic. So there's a lot of reasons why a genetic modified food could create an increase in allergies. In the UK, they took a genetically modified potato and they fed it to rats. And the rats ended up with potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles due to retarded development of the organs, partial atrophy of the liver, and a damaged immune system. And it remains the most in-depth animal feeding study ever published on the safety of genetically engineered foods. And it shows that these foods might inherently be unsafe. Dr. Arpad Pustai, before the study was completed, was invited to speak on television. And he expressed his concerns about genetically engineered foods and how the public is being used as guinea pigs in an uncontrolled experiment. When news of his research came out, he was a hero for 2 days at his prestigious institute. But then on a Tuesday evening, 2 phone calls were allegedly placed from the Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the institute's director. The next morning, Wednesday morning, Arpad Pustai was fired after 35 years and silenced with threats of a lawsuit.
Personally, I've been contacted by telephone and email by a number of scientists who have serious concerns about aspects of the research that is taking place in various institutions in New Zealand and the increasingly close ties that are developing between science and commerce, but who are convinced that if they express these fears publicly, or even if they ask the awkward and difficult questions, they will be eased out of their institution.
Because of my involvement in the genetic engineering debate, I became very unpopular with the genetic engineers in my department. So I was, let's put it mildly, very strongly encouraged to retire early. Okay, I mean, I was basically hounded out of the department and the university that I had taught in for nearly 25 years.
And a UC Berkeley professor claims that he was being threatened by a senior Mexican government official who tried to get him not to publish incriminating evidence.
He pressured me in a pretty nasty way, threatened and did everything he could to try and convince me that I shouldn't publish.
The vast majority of the academic plant science is funded directly or indirectly from industry. And so that is one of the reasons that, at least I believe, that the academic plant biologists are somewhat hesitant about taking issue with some of the plant biotechnology, food issues.
This fear among scientists and the control by the biotech industry has meant that there has not been a lot of follow-up to evidence suggesting that genetically modified foods are unsafe, even inside governments. For example, in the Food and Drug Administration, they were approving the very first genetically modified drug. It was a drug injected into cows to increase milk supply. It's called recombinant bovine growth hormone, or RBGH. Scientists complain that this might be unhealthy for humans eating the dairy products and drinking the milk. But those who complained were fired, stripped of responsibilities, or forced out. The remaining whistleblowers had to write an anonymous letter to Congress claiming that there was fraud and conflict of interest in the department. Scientists have been concerned that genes might jump from the genetically modified food to gut bacteria. The biotech industry had claimed that the genes were destroyed during digestion and that no transfer was possible. The only human feeding study, however, contradicted that. It showed that genes that had been inserted into soy actually jumped from the soy and now took up residence inside the DNA of the gut bacteria inside the human beings. So even if we stop eating genetically modified soy, it's possible that the protein that it's engineered to create will continue to be produced inside of us. Organizations like the American Medical Association, the World Health Organization, and others were concerned that the antibiotic-resistant marker genes, which are inserted into genetically modified foods, might jump to our gut bacteria, and that could create new diseases that would be resistant to antibiotics. Also, when you genetically modify something, you have to put in a promoter, something to turn on that foreign gene so it operates 24/7 around the clock. But it turns out that this promoter can turn on other genes at random up and down the DNA. So inside the corn or soy, it might turn on other genes which could be allergenic or toxic or carcinogenic or anti-nutritional. But we now know that that promoter also transfers to gut bacteria. In addition, preliminary evidence showed that the promoter transferred to the organs, the internal organs of rats, after a single meal. Now, earlier we talked about corn that was genetically engineered to produce its own pesticide. Imagine the gene that produces the pesticide transferring to gut bacteria. Now you have a gene inside the DNA, inside our intestines, producing pesticide. It converts our bacteria into living pesticide factories. Tragically, children are most at risk from the potential dangers of genetically engineered foods. They have young, developing bodies, so they're going to be more at risk from possible toxins or nutritional problems. Children are more susceptible to allergies, 3 to 4 times more susceptible than adults, especially children below 2 years old. Also, children drink a lot of milk. Now, the cows injected with genetically engineered bovine growth hormone produce milk with an increased level of a hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. Those with high levels of IGF-1 in their systems are much more likely to develop breast cancer and prostate cancer. Also, a lot of children have to take antibiotics because of ear infections and other problems. If there are antibiotic-resistant super diseases, that's going to have a tremendous impact on children.
American companies who release these genetically modified foodstuffs have never done proper risk assessment on them. Monsanto said that their genetically modified soya is safe. Then the FDA regarded that as evidence for its safety.
What concerns me is that the health risks of genetically modified organisms in agriculture are only assessed through relatively rudimentary biochemical analysis and short-term feeding trials of animals. And these are totally inadequate.
They feed these animals for only about 4 weeks. Sometimes, on one occasion, I think it was 6 weeks. You can't do cancer experiments in that time. And certainly they were not fed to animals and pregnant animals to see what happened in the offspring. And certainly biochemistry, immunology, tissue pathology, gut function, liver function and kidney function do not seem to be done.
Personally, I have a hard time trusting the 5 or 6 companies in the biotechnology industry which now control our seed supply. I have a hard time trusting them because they are essentially the same companies that brought us pesticides, that told us that pesticides were harmless, that pretended to show spokespeople eating them on television by the spoonful. Of course, it turned out later what they were eating was powdered milk because they weren't stupid enough to actually eat DDT. But these are companies with decades and decades of well-documented lying to the American public.
Many scientists say that industry research is rigged to avoid finding problems.
We need to have good independent safety testing of genetically engineered foods. In other words, safety testing that is not done by the applicant company.
I would recommend that perhaps we could set up human clinical trials using volunteers or genetically engineered scientists and their families, because I think they are so convinced of the safety of the products that they are creating that I'm sure they would very readily volunteer to become part of a human clinical trial.
A lot of information today shows that food influences mood and behavior. For example, a study on 3-year-olds showed that 25% of tantrums in the study were due to food coloring and additives added to the juice they were drinking. Also, changes in diet of prisoners and probationers dramatically changed their behavior. A Dutch student took 2 groups of mice. One he fed genetically modified food, the other non-genetically modified food. Those on the natural food played with each other and acted like mice. Those with the genetically modified food stopped playing with each other, sort of retired in their corners and were very non-social. Also, they were very much more scared of him when he went into the cages to pick them up to weigh them, and one was inexplicably found dead at the end of the experiment. Now, does this mean that genetically modified foods will affect behavior of animals or humans? It would certainly be irresponsible to say so based on a single experiment. But by the same token, it would be irresponsible to say that it doesn't, because no studies have actually been done to verify whether in fact there's an influence on behavior. There's a school in Appleton, Wisconsin that changed its diet from the normal daily school meals that kids eat all over the country to wholesome, delicious, and nutritious food, and the change was amazing. They weren't intending to, but when they removed processed foods from the school meals, they removed almost all sources of genetically engineered products. I mention this school in my book, Seeds of Deception, because after about 7 chapters of telling the reader about the dangers of genetically engineered foods and all the rat studies and human problems, I figured someone would still possibly have the excuse, well, I'm going to die anyway. I like sharing the clips of the Appleton documentary as added inspiration for people to change their diet.
The Appleton Area School District in Wisconsin is taking a community-wide approach to school nutrition.
In January of 1997, I visited Central High School as a prospective employee and observed the students that were housed here at the time and found them to be rude, obnoxious, very crude, and ill-mannered.
I was brought over to the school because the school was out of control. They were having a lot of problems with rebellious students, weapons violation, things of that nature. So they wanted a cop on school premise at all times.
We started the food program approximately 3.5 years ago. One Friday, the kids were here. They had candy machines and pop machines in the student lounge. The following Monday, they came to school and they were greeted by water coolers and healthy bagels and energy drink for breakfast.
Since we started the program, the Nutrition, the Natural Ovens program, with the complete diet, the balanced diet, I have seen a total change in the students and the environment within the school. It's amazing.
Now that I actually have a job here, I was hesitant once again to start and found that the atmosphere is entirely different. The students are calm, they're well behaved. I don't have to deal with the daily discipline issues, out and out disciplining of students. That just isn't an issue here.
Every year, we are required to file a state report. On the state report, they include information regarding the number of dropouts, expulsions, drugs, weapons, suicides. Since we've started this program, zeros is what I have had to report. It's a pretty nice report to fill out.
Our biggest problems right now at this school are parking in the parking lot and student tardiness. I don't have the disruptions in class or the difficulties with student behavior that perhaps I experienced 4 years ago before we started the food program.
Now that I concentrate, I think it is easier to get along with people. Because now I'm paying attention to what they have to say and just not worrying about what I need to say to them.
Healthy food has had more of an impact than we thought. We believed that it would help settle the kids down, which it has done, but I think we were surprised the impact it's had on academic learning.
Personally, I think I've been able to demand more academically from my students over the last few years.
I notice in conference time, a lot of parents will say, you know, that nutrition unit is really making a difference.
This is the first generation in history that might not outlive their parents because of health and lifestyle issues, nutrition and fitness.
I can't buy the argument that it's too costly for schools to provide good nutrition for their students. I found that one cost will reduce another. I don't have the vandalism. I don't have the litter. I don't have the need for high security.
We've cut $5 million out of our operational budget in the last 2 years. We did 35 focus groups in the community, and not one person brought up the issue of you should get back into junk-type foods because they see that healthy lifestyles is important. I believe in 3 or 4 years, every school in the country will be into a nutrition program because the more schools that are going in that direction, they're seeing it does make a difference.
We've got to stop using our most precious commodity, our kids, to make extra money.
Schools throughout the UK have banned GM foods a long time ago, as have schools in selected cities from around Europe. In Italy, in fact, schools are required to serve organic foods, as they are in Berkeley and Palo Alto, California. And around the United States, more and more schools are removing junk food. They're removing the sodas, they're removing the candies. It's time that we extend that ban to include genetic modification. There are 4 major genetically modified crops: soy, corn, cotton, which is used in cottonseed oil, and canola. Actually, all 4 are used in vegetable oil. Now, soy and corn have a lot of offspring, derivatives that are found in many of the processed foods that we eat. So it's to avoid genetically modified foods, it's often easy to avoid processed foods, and you can avoid the 2 at the same time. Now, there's also Hawaiian papaya, and a little bit of zucchini and crookneck squash, and Quest tobacco. And that's the only genetically modified crops that are currently commercialized. The tomato was taken off the market, the potato was taken off the market, and several other varieties have been approved but not introduced commercially. Milk from cows treated with genetically modified bovine growth hormone are also considered genetically modified. And there are also enzymes and additives that are created from genetically modified bacteria or fungus. Now, typically, they're not labeled. Aspartame, which is a sweetener, is one exception.
The same companies that produce GMO-laden processed food in the U.S. market produce GMO-free products in the European market. We have a lot of power as consumers. We have to exercise it. We should be asking everywhere that we buy food if their products contain genetically engineered ingredients, and insist that we will only buy products from them that are demonstrably free of GMOs.
So we have to get the word out and educate people to describe how these foods may be impacting ourselves and our children, so we can make those choices and move the market.
Studies show that the majority of people do not want GM foods. And interestingly, the studies also show that the more educated people are, the less likely they are to feel comfortable about it and support it. And the more knowledge people have about it, the less they like it.
Eyewitness reports from all over North America describe how several types of animals, when given a choice, avoid eating genetically modified foods.
The cows didn't care for it. We put BT corn and conventional corn in the feed bunk, and they cleaned up the conventional corn and left the BT corn. They did not eat it. In South Dakota, where they leave food plots stand for the wildlife, that the deer won't eat Roundup Ready corn.
Our knowledge of genetics is still far too rudimentary, and genetic engineering technology far too crude for the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment and their entry into the food chain to be justified. This is particularly important when one bears in mind that genetically modified organisms, once released, are uncontainable and unrecallable if problems happen to arise.
These might be the basis for real, and we shouldn't use, scientists are not supposed to use strong words, but these might be the basis for real ecological and health catastrophes. That's a fact.
People who boost genetic engineering are going to have to do a mea culpa and come clean and ask for forgiveness like the Pope did on the Inquisition. You know, we made a mistake, and let's start over.
I'd just like to speak as a father. I think that we have to think of the next generation, and I would hate for us now to make decisions that prohibit them from making their own decisions later on. I wouldn't like to sell my children's future for a handful of magic beans.
We're part of this huge, uncontrolled experiment. Millions of people are being fed GM foods every day without knowing the impacts on health, behavior, or our children. These foods could be eroding the health of the people of the planet, and the impacts on children could be far worse. With the rise in obesity and diabetes, with the dramatic results in Appleton, with the growing body of research that suggests that GM foods are not safe and should never have been approved, a complete overhaul of our diet and school meal programs is long overdue.
Join communities all over who are organizing to remove genetically engineered foods from school meals. To find out more, go to gmfreeschools.org or call the GM Free School campaign at 641-209-1765.
By taking simple steps now, we can protect those we love and future generations.